Have you ever been in a situation where someone looked right through you, dismissed you completely based on what they saw on the surface? Maybe it happened at work, maybe in your personal life. If you're watching from Chicago, New York, or anywhere else where people think they can size you up in seconds, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because sometimes the person they're underestimating is the very one who'll bring their whole world crashing down. Detective Isabella Rodriguez adjusted her bulletproof vest one final time, her dark eyes scanning the team assembled around her in the cramped surveillance van. At 28, she'd worked twice as hard as most of her colleagues to earn her spot on the organized crime task force, and tonight was supposed to be her moment. 3 months of surveillance, carefully planted informants, and meticulous planning had led to this raid on Dante Moretti's flagship nightclub. The club pulsed with bass-heavy music even from the street, neon lights casting purple and red shadows across the rain-licked pavement. Isabella could see the line of well-dressed patrons waiting to get inside, completely unaware that federal agents were about to storm through those doors. She'd studied everything about Dante Moretti. 34 years old, inherited his father's territory when he was barely 25, and had spent the last 9 years expanding the family's influence throughout the city. He was smart, ruthless, and according to her sources, would be in his private office on the 3rd floor tonight conducting a major money laundering operation. Isabella touched the wire taped to her ribs beneath her fitted black sweater. The plan was simple. Her team would sweep the main floor while she and Detective Martinez made their way upstairs to catch Moretti red-handed with the financial records they needed to finally put him away. "Ready, Rodriguez?" her partner asked through her earpiece. "Ready," she confirmed, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The team moved with practiced precision, flooding through the club's entrance with badges raised and weapons drawn. Patrons screamed and scattered as Isabella pushed through the chaos, her curvy frame moving with surprising agility as she navigated between overturned tables and abandoned drinks. She reached the staircase leading to the private floors, taking the steps 2 at a time. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but not from exertion. This was it, the moment she'd been working toward for years. Bringing down one of the city's most untouchable crime bosses would prove she belonged here, that her instincts and dedication mattered more than the doubts she constantly faced from colleagues who thought she was too soft, too emotional, too much of everything they didn't expect in a detective. Isabella burst through the office door with her weapon raised, Martinez right behind her. The spacious room was elegantly appointed with dark leather furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, but it was completely empty. No Dante Moretti, no financial records, no evidence of any kind. Her stomach dropped as the implications hit her. They'd been played. Well, a deep voice said from behind them. Isabella spun around to find herself face-to-face with the man she'd been hunting for months. Dante Moretti stood in the doorway, completely relaxed in an expensive charcoal suit that emphasized his tall, broad-shouldered frame. His dark hair was styled perfectly despite the chaos downstairs, and his green-gray eyes held a mixture of amusement and disdain as they swept over her. He was even more striking in person than in the surveillance photos, with sharp cheekbones and an olive complexion that spoke to his Italian heritage. But it was his presence that truly commanded attention. Even unarmed and supposedly cornered, he radiated the kind of quiet confidence that came from never having been truly threatened. "Detective Rodriguez, I presume," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of an accent. "Though I have to say, you're not quite what I expected." "Dante Moretti, you're under arrest for," Isabella began, but he cut her off with a low chuckle that made her skin flush with anger. "For what exactly, detective? Having a drink in my own establishment?" His gaze traveled deliberately down her body and back up, lingering on her curves in a way that made her want to cross her arms defensively. "You know, when I heard the police department's organized crime unit was sending their best and brightest after me, I pictured someone a little more intimidating." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd heard variations of this dismissal her entire career, but coming from him, in this moment when she was supposed to be in control, it stung with particular cruelty. "I pictured someone who might actually pose a threat," he continued, his tone conversational but his eyes cold. "Not someone who looks like she spends more time at the donut shop than the gym." Martinez shifted beside her, tension radiating from his stance, but Isabella forced herself to remain perfectly still. She would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Dante stepped further into the room, his movements casual and unhurried. You really thought you could waltz in here and catch me off guard? With your little wire and your ambitious dreams? He shook his head, that infuriating smile never leaving his lips. Detective Rodriguez, you're out of your league. Way out of your league. Isabella's training warred with her burning humiliation as she realized the truth. Someone had warned him. All her careful planning, all her hopes for this career-defining bust, had been for nothing. Worse than nothing. She'd walked her entire team into a trap, and now Dante Moretti was standing there looking at her like she was nothing more than an amusing interruption to his evening. The wire, Isabella said quietly, her voice barely steady. Oh, that little thing? Dante reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small electronic device. Been jamming your signal for the last 10 minutes. Your backup isn't coming, detective. They think everything's going according to plan down there while you're up here learning a very important lesson about knowing your place. Isabella's weapon felt heavy in her hands as the reality of her situation settled over her. Not only had the raid failed spectacularly, but she was alone and completely cut off from her team. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to salvage what was left of this disaster and regroup. But Dante wasn't finished with his humiliation. You want some advice, Detective Rodriguez? Stick to traffic violations and petty theft. Leave the real police work to people who actually understand what they're dealing with. This life, my life, isn't something a naive little girl from whatever suburb you crawled out of can comprehend. His words were designed to cut deep, and they succeeded. Isabella had grown up in one of the city's roughest neighborhoods, had fought for every opportunity and every ounce of respect she'd earned. But looking at Dante's perfectly tailored suit and the casual way he commanded this situation, she felt every insecurity she'd ever harbored about not being enough rising to the surface. Martinez touched her arm gently. Rodriguez, we need to go. Isabella wanted to argue, wanted to find some way to salvage this catastrophe, but she could hear shouts from the street below. The rest of her team was probably already retreating, having found nothing but empty rooms and scrubbed computers. She lowered her weapon slowly, her dark eyes never leaving Dante's face. This isn't over, Moretti. He laughed again, the sound rich and genuinely amused. Oh, Detective Rodriguez. For you, it never even started. The walk back through the club felt like the longest of Isabella's life. Patrons were filing back in, the party resuming as if nothing had happened, while she and her team made their retreat with empty hands and wounded pride. Every step felt like acknowledgement of failure, every glance from the club's security team a reminder that they'd been outmaneuvered completely. Outside, Captain Morrison was waiting by the surveillance van, his expression grim. Rodriguez. In the van. Now. Isabella climbed into the cramped space, still feeling the sting of Dante's dismissal burning in her chest. The captain's weathered face showed every one of his 50-plus years as he rubbed his temples wearily. 3 months of work down the drain, he said without preamble. 3 months, and we got nothing. Worse than nothing. We look like amateurs. Captain, we had solid intelligence, Isabella began, but he held up a hand. Intelligence that was clearly compromised, which means we have a leak, or we're dealing with someone smarter than we gave him credit for. Either way, this is a disaster. Isabella stared at her hands, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. She could still hear Dante's voice, still see that infuriating smile as he dismissed her completely. The worst part was that he'd been right. She had been out of her league tonight. But that's not why I asked you here, Rodriguez, Morrison continued, his tone shifting slightly. I have a proposition for you. Isabella looked up, surprised by the change in his voice. How do you feel about deep cover work? The question caught her completely off guard. Deep cover was the holy grail for ambitious detectives, but also the most dangerous assignment possible. Officers could spend months or even years embedded in criminal organizations, constantly walking the line between maintaining their cover and gathering evidence. What kind of deep cover, Captain? Morrison pulled out a thick file and set it on the small table between them. The kind where you get a chance for payback against the man who just humiliated you and your entire team. Isabella's pulse quickened as she opened the file and saw Dante's photograph clipped to the first page. But this wasn't a surveillance photo. This looked like a professional headshot, the kind used for business profiles. Moretti's been arranging a marriage, Morrison explained. Traditional arranged marriage to solidify a territory deal with a family in Sicily. His bride is supposed to arrive next week. Isabella scanned the documents, her mind racing. Supposed to arrive? Flight got delayed indefinitely due to a family emergency. Very convenient timing. The captain's eyes glinted with something that looked almost like satisfaction. We need someone to take her place. The implications hit Isabella like a freight train. You want me to pose as his arranged bride? I want you to get close enough to bring down his entire operation from the inside. Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Think you can handle being underestimated now, Rodriguez? Because that man just gave you the perfect cover. He thinks you're a joke. Use it. Isabella stared at the file, her mind still reeling from the disastrous raid, and now this impossible opportunity. Going undercover as Dante Moretti's bride would mean living in his world, being close enough to gather evidence that could finally bring him down. But it would also mean constant danger, months of deception, and getting intimately close to a man who had just crushed her professional pride without breaking a sweat. Her hands steadied as determination replaced humiliation. Dante Moretti thought she was out of her league. He thought she didn't understand his world. She was about to show him exactly how wrong he could be. I'll do it, she said quietly. Good, Morrison replied, closing the file. Because your new identity as Bella Ricci arrives tomorrow morning. Welcome to the most dangerous assignment of your career, Detective Rodriguez. Isabella stared at her reflection in the federal building's bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. The transformation had taken 3 hours with the bureau's best stylists, and the results were stunning. Gone was Detective Rodriguez with her practical ponytail and minimal makeup. In her place stood Bella Ricci, a sophisticated woman who looked like she belonged in the pages of an Italian fashion magazine. Her naturally curvy figure was elegantly showcased in a cream-colored designer dress that hugged her waist and flowed gracefully to her knees. Her dark hair had been styled in loose waves that framed her face, and subtle but expert makeup highlighted her warm brown eyes and full lips. Even her posture had changed during the brief training session. She carried herself with the confident grace of a woman who had never doubted her place in the world. The contact lenses that changed her eye color from deep brown to hazel were still uncomfortable, but they were a necessary precaution. Every detail of her appearance had been carefully crafted to ensure that Dante Moretti would see exactly what he expected to see. His arranged bride from Sicily, not the detective who had failed so spectacularly in his office just 48 hours ago. Isabella touched the delicate gold necklace at her throat, a family heirloom that supposedly belonged to the fictional Bella Ricci. The entire identity had been constructed with meticulous care. Birth records in Sicily, a childhood spent in convent schools, a family tragically killed in a car accident that left her alone and dependent on distant relatives who arranged this marriage. It was a story designed to explain any gaps in her knowledge while appealing to Dante's protective instincts. You're beautiful, Agent Chen said softly from behind her. The FBI handler was a petite woman in her 40s with kind eyes and 20 years of undercover experience. He'll never suspect a thing. Isabella turned away from the mirror, adjusting the small purse that contained her new identification papers and a panic button disguised as a vintage compact. I still can't believe this is happening. 2 days ago, I was planning his arrest, and now I'm about to pretend to be his bride. That's exactly why it's going to work, Chen replied. He's arrogant enough to believe he's completely untouchable. The idea that the same woman he humiliated could be sitting across from him at dinner won't even occur to him. Isabella nodded, though doubt still gnawed at her stomach. She'd spent the last 2 days memorizing every detail of Bella Ricci's fabricated life, practicing her slightly different accent, and learning enough about Sicily to maintain her cover. But all the preparation in the world couldn't ease the anxiety of walking willingly into the lion's den. Remember, your cover story explains any nervousness as wedding jitters and grief over your family, Chen continued. Let him see what he wants to see, a sheltered woman who needs his protection. Make him feel powerful and in control. Isabella almost laughed at the irony. After years of fighting to be seen as strong and capable, she was now being asked to appear vulnerable and dependent. But if it meant bringing down Dante Moretti's organization from the inside, She would play whatever role necessary. The restaurant Dante had chosen for their first meeting was exactly what Isabella expected. Expensive, exclusive, and designed to impress. Cristiano's occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of the city skyline. The maitre d' led her through the dimly lit dining room past tables where well-dressed couples spoke in hushed voices over champagne and cuisine that cost more than most people's weekly salary. Signora Ricci, the maitre d' said in heavily accented English, Signor Moretti is waiting for you in our private dining room. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs as they approached an elegant door marked with discreet brass numbers. This was it. The moment that would determine whether months of planning and preparation had been worth the risk. She took a steadying breath and stepped through the doorway. Dante Moretti rose from his chair as she entered, and Isabella felt her breath catch despite herself. In the subdued lighting of the club during the raid, she'd registered his height and general attractiveness, but hadn't been prepared for the full impact of his presence. He was even more imposing than she remembered, tall and broad-shouldered in a perfectly tailored navy suit that emphasized his athletic build. His dark hair was styled with casual perfection, and those distinctive green-gray eyes that had looked at her with such disdain now held warmth and genuine appreciation. "Bella," he said, moving toward her with confident grace. His voice carried the same slight accent she remembered, but instead of mockery, it held something that sounded almost like wonder. "You're even more beautiful than your photographs suggested." He took her hand and brought it to his lips in a gesture that should have seemed old-fashioned but instead felt naturally elegant. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through Isabella that she quickly suppressed. This was Dante Moretti, the man who had humiliated her and derailed her career. The fact that he was attractive and charming didn't change anything. "Thank you," she replied, allowing just a hint of shyness to color her voice. "You're very kind, Dante. Please, sit," he said, pulling out her chair with old-world courtesy. "I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of ordering wine. I thought we might both need something to ease the awkwardness of this situation." Isabella settled into the plush chair, hyper-aware of his proximity as he moved around to his own seat. The private dining room was intimate without being cramped, decorated in warm gold tones with fresh flowers and candles creating an atmosphere more suited to romance than a business arrangement. "This is awkward," she agreed with a small laugh, accepting the glass of wine he offered. "I never imagined I'd be meeting my future husband in quite these circumstances." Dante's smile was rueful as he studied her face. "I have to admit, when my mother first suggested this arrangement, I thought it was an archaic waste of time. But looking at you now, I'm beginning to think she might be wiser than I gave her credit for." There was something in his tone that made Isabella glance up from her wine glass. Instead of the cold calculation she expected, she saw what looked like genuine interest in his eyes. Not just physical attraction, though that was clearly present, but something deeper. Curiosity, perhaps, or appreciation for more than just her appearance. "Tell me about yourself, Bella," he continued, leaning back in his chair, but keeping his attention focused entirely on her. "I know the basic information from our families, but I want to hear about you. What do you love? What makes you happy?" The question caught Isabella off guard. She'd prepared for discussions about family history, wedding arrangements, and living situations, but not for this kind of personal interest. In her experience, men like Dante Moretti viewed marriage as a business transaction. The fact that he seemed genuinely curious about her thoughts and feelings was both unexpected and dangerously appealing. "I love books," she said honestly, drawing on her real interests to make her performance more authentic. "Reading has always been my escape, especially during difficult times. And music. I play piano, though I haven't had much opportunity lately." "What kind of books?" he asked, and she could tell he was actually listening to her answer, not just making polite conversation. "Everything, really. Literature, history, mysteries. I suppose I'm drawn to stories about people overcoming impossible situations and finding strength they didn't know they possessed." Dante nodded thoughtfully. "That explains a lot about someone who's willing to marry a stranger and move to a new country to start over." Isabella felt a stab of guilt at the sincerity in his voice. He had no idea how accurately his words described her current situation, though not in the way he imagined. She was indeed trying to overcome an impossible situation and find strength she didn't know she possessed. She just wasn't the person he thought she was. "What about you?" she asked, deflecting attention from herself. "What brings you joy, Dante?" "Family," he replied without hesitation. "Everything I do is for family. My mother, my cousins, the people who depend on me. I know what the world thinks about men in my position, but everything comes back to taking care of the people I love." There was something almost vulnerable in his admission, a glimpse of the man beneath the powerful exterior. Isabella found herself leaning forward, genuinely curious despite herself. "That must be a heavy burden sometimes," she said softly. Dante's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something unguarded there. Loneliness, perhaps, or the weight of constant responsibility. "It can be," he admitted. "But that's why this arrangement makes sense for both of us. You need security and protection after losing your family. I need someone who understands that my first loyalty will always be to my responsibilities." Traditional marriages work because both people know what's expected. Isabella nodded, though her chest tightened at his matter-of-fact tone. He was being completely honest about viewing their marriage as a practical arrangement, which should have made her job easier. Instead, she found herself oddly disappointed by his pragmatic approach. The evening continued with surprising ease. Dante was an attentive companion, asking thoughtful questions and sharing stories about his childhood in Sicily and his mother's influence on his life. He spoke about his business interests in carefully vague terms, but his love for his family and genuine concern for her comfort were clearly authentic. By the time their plates were cleared, Isabella was struggling with an uncomfortable realization. Dante Moretti was nothing like what she'd expected. Yes, he was arrogant and clearly dangerous, but he was also intelligent, surprisingly thoughtful, and undeniably charming. Worse, she found herself genuinely attracted to him in a way that had nothing to do with his appearance and everything to do with the way he made her feel seen and valued. "I've arranged for you to see the penthouse tomorrow," he said as they prepared to leave. "If it suits you, you can move in whenever you're comfortable. I want you to feel at home there." Isabella's pulse quickened at the mention of living arrangements. Getting inside Dante's private space was exactly what she needed for her investigation, but the thought of sharing living quarters with him created a flutter of nerves that had nothing to do with the mission. "That's very generous," she replied. "I appreciate your patience with all of this." Dante stepped closer as they waited for the elevator, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and her traitorous heart sped up at the possibility. Instead, he took her hand again, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "Bella, I want you to know that this doesn't have to be just a business arrangement. I hope we can build something real together." The sincerity in his voice made Isabella's chest ache with guilt. Here was a man offering her genuine partnership and emotional connection, and she was planning to destroy his life. For a moment, she almost forgot why she was there, almost let herself imagine what it would be like to accept his offer at face value. Then she remembered his cruel laughter 2 nights ago, the way he'd dismissed her as weak and incompetent, and her resolve hardened. Dante Moretti might be charming and attractive, but he was still a criminal who thought he was untouchable. Her job was to prove him wrong. "I'd like that too," she lied, forcing warmth into her smile. As Dante's driver took her back to her temporary apartment, Isabella stared out at the city lights and tried to process the evening's revelations. Her target was more complex than she'd anticipated, which could either make her job easier or infinitely more dangerous. The fact that she was already struggling with unwanted attraction to him was definitely a complication she hadn't planned for. But as she touched the panic button hidden in her purse, Isabella reminded herself of the stakes. Bringing down Dante's organization could save countless lives and finally give her the career recognition she'd been fighting for. Whatever she was starting to feel for him, she couldn't let it interfere with the most important assignment of her life. The game had officially begun. Isabella woke to the smell of coffee and something that might have been pancakes, which was impossible because she distinctly remembered falling asleep alone in the guest bedroom of Dante's penthouse. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a space so beautiful it belonged in an architectural magazine. The guest suite was larger than her entire apartment, decorated in soothing cream and gold tones with furniture that probably cost more than her annual salary. She'd moved in the previous afternoon, bringing only the small suitcase that contained Bella Ricci's modest belongings. Dante had given her a tour of the sprawling penthouse, pointing out his office, the media room, and the spectacular kitchen while maintaining a careful distance that suggested he was trying to respect her comfort level. The whole experience had felt surreal, like playing house with someone she was planning to betray. Now, padding barefoot across the heated marble floors in her silk pajamas, Isabella followed the enticing smells to the kitchen and stopped short in the doorway. Dante stood at the massive granite island, dressed casually in dark jeans and a gray sweater that emphasized his broad shoulders, carefully plating what looked like genuine Italian pancakes. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and he moved around the professional-grade kitchen with the confidence of someone who actually knew how to cook. "Good morning," he said without turning around, somehow sensing her presence. "I hope you're hungry. My mother always said the secret to a happy marriage is making sure your wife never goes hungry." Isabella felt her heart do something complicated at the casual way he'd said wife, as if the word belonged between them naturally. She forced herself to focus on the investigative opportunity this domestic moment presented rather than the way his voice sounded rougher in the morning. "You cook," she said, settling onto one of the bar stools across from him. "I have to admit, I didn't expect that." Dante glanced up with a smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less guarded. "My mother made sure all her children could take care of themselves. She said depending on others for basic needs makes you weak." He placed a plate in front of her, and Isabella's mouth watered despite herself. The pancakes were clearly homemade, golden and perfect, topped with fresh berries and a light dusting of powdered sugar. When was the last time someone had cooked for her? When was the last time anyone had cared enough to notice whether she ate breakfast? "These are beautiful," she said, and meant it. "Thank you, Dante." His pleased expression made something warm unfold in her chest, which was problematic for about a dozen reasons. Isabella took a bite and couldn't suppress a small sound of appreciation. The pancakes were incredible, light and flavorful with just a hint of lemon that elevated them beyond anything she'd ever tasted. "Good?" he asked, pouring coffee from what looked like a professional espresso machine. "Amazing. Where did you learn to cook like this?" Dante leaned against the counter across from her, his own coffee cradled in his hands. "After my father died, my mother went through a period where she couldn't bear to eat. She was wasting away, and nothing any of us said could convince her to take care of herself. So I started learning to make all her favorite dishes from her childhood in Sicily. Eventually, she started eating again, just to spare my feelings when I present her with these elaborate meals I'd spent hours preparing." There was something heartbreaking about the image of a young Dante desperately trying to save his grieving mother through food and determination. Isabella found herself studying his face, looking for traces of that worried boy in the powerful man before her. "That must have been terrifying for you," she said softly. "It was," he admitted. "Losing my father was devastating, but watching my mother disappear into her grief was worse in some ways. You feel so helpless when someone you love is slipping away and nothing you do seems to matter." Isabella's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. She'd prepared herself to hate Dante Moretti, to see him as nothing more than a criminal target who deserved whatever consequences her investigation brought down on him. But listening to him talk about caring for his mother, seeing the vulnerability he tried to hide beneath his confident exterior, made it impossible to maintain that simple view. "She's better now?" Isabella asked. "Much better. She actually moved back to Sicily last year. Said she wanted to spend her remaining years surrounded by the memories of her youth. But she calls me every Sunday to make sure I'm eating properly and asks when I'm going to give her grandchildren." The comment about grandchildren hung in the air between them, loaded with implications about their supposed future together. Isabella felt heat creep up her neck as she imagined what that conversation might have been like. Dante telling his mother about his arranged marriage and the possibility of the family line continuing. "Is that why you agreed to this arrangement?" she asked, genuine curiosity overriding her caution. "To give her grandchildren?" Dante was quiet for a long moment, his green-gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Partly," he said finally, "but also because I'm tired of being alone, Bella. I'm 34 years old, and I've never had a relationship that wasn't complicated by what I do for a living. Women either want the excitement of being with someone dangerous, or they're terrified of the reality of my world. I thought an arranged marriage might give me a chance at something real with someone who understood the situation from the beginning. His honesty was like a physical blow. Here he was, offering her genuine insight into his motivations and fears, while she sat there lying about everything from her name to her intentions. The guilt was becoming harder to ignore, especially when he looked at her like she might actually be the answer to his loneliness. "I should let you get settled," he said, apparently misinterpreting her silence as discomfort. "I have some business to handle this morning, but I'll be back this afternoon. Please, make yourself at home. Everything here is yours now, too." After he left, Isabella spent nearly an hour exploring the penthouse with the systematic thoroughness of a trained investigator. The space was enormous, easily 4,000 square feet of luxurious living space with breathtaking views of the city from every window. But it was also surprisingly personal, filled with family photographs and artwork that spoke to genuine taste rather than expensive decorating. She found herself lingering over the pictures of a younger Dante with what was clearly his mother, a small, elegant woman with warm eyes and a radiant smile. There were photos of him with various cousins and family members, images from what looked like holidays and celebrations where everyone seemed genuinely happy to be together. Whatever else Dante Moretti might be, he was clearly someone who valued family above everything else. His home office was exactly what she'd expected to find, sophisticated and masculine, with a massive desk, built-in bookshelves, and state-of-the-art computer equipment. But when Isabella tried the desk drawers and filing cabinets, everything was locked with what looked like high-tech security systems. Getting access to his business records was going to require more time and probably some technical assistance from the bureau. What she did find, tucked into a bookshelf between leather-bound volumes of Italian poetry, was a small framed photograph that stopped her cold. It showed Dante as a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, standing next to a hospital bed where his mother lay pale and frail-looking. His young face was tight with worry and determination, and Isabella could see the exact moment when he decided to become the man who would protect everyone he loved. The photo humanized him in a way that made her chest ache. This wasn't just some criminal who'd chosen easy money over honest work. This was someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast and take responsibility for people who depended on him. It didn't excuse his choices, but it explained them in ways that made her job infinitely more complicated. That evening, Dante returned with groceries and an apology for leaving her alone all day. Isabella found herself in the kitchen again, this time helping him prepare dinner while he told her about growing up in his family's neighborhood. Everyone knew everyone, he explained, dicing vegetables with practiced efficiency. If someone was in trouble, the whole community rallied to help. If someone stepped out of line, the whole community made sure they understood the consequences. It wasn't perfect, but people took care of each other. "It sounds wonderful," Isabella said, and realized she meant it. Growing up in foster care had meant constantly moving between families who saw her as a temporary responsibility. The idea of belonging somewhere, of being part of a community that would protect and support you, was deeply appealing. It was, until the neighborhood started changing and outside influences moved in, Dante said, his tone darkening. People who didn't understand our way of life, who thought they could come in and disrupt families that had been there for generations. Isabella tensed, recognizing the shift in his voice. Was he talking about law enforcement? About people like her? Before she could ask, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. Dante glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened into something cold and dangerous that reminded her exactly who she was dealing with. "Excuse me," he said, his voice clipped. "I need to take this." Isabella pretended to focus on the salad she was preparing while straining to hear his side of the conversation. He'd moved to the far end of the kitchen and was speaking in rapid Italian, but she could catch enough words to understand that someone was threatening something important to him. When he returned, the easy domesticity of moments before had vanished. His jaw was tight with barely controlled anger, and Isabella could practically feel the tension radiating from his frame. "Everything all right?" she asked carefully. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said, but she could hear the lie in his voice. "Just some business complications that require my attention." Dante moved to the window that overlooked the city, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested he was thinking through options she probably didn't want to know about. In that moment, backlit by the setting sun, he looked every inch the dangerous man she knew him to be. "Is this what our life will be like?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "You getting threatening phone calls and me wondering if you're coming home?" He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his expression nearly undid her. "Bella, I won't lie to you about what I am or what my world involves. But I will promise you that I will never let any of it touch you. You'll always be safe with me." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made something flutter in Isabella's chest. She believed him, which was perhaps the most dangerous realization of all. Dante Moretti, criminal or not, would protect her with his life, if necessary. Before she could respond, he crossed the space between them in 2 quick strides and framed her face with his hands. His green-gray eyes searched hers for permission, and Isabella found herself nodding even as her rational mind screamed warnings. When he kissed her, it was nothing like what she'd expected. She'd imagined he would be demanding, overwhelming, taking what he wanted without consideration for her response. Instead, his lips were gentle against hers, questioning rather than claiming, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But pulling away was the last thing Isabella wanted to do. Despite every logical reason she should resist, despite the mission and the deception and the fact that this man was supposed to be her target, she found herself melting into his embrace. Her hands fisted in the soft material of his sweater, and she kissed him back with a desperation that should have terrified her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dante rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I saw you," he admitted quietly. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs as the full implications of what had just happened crashed over her. She was falling for her target. Worse, she was falling for him while lying about everything that mattered, and the guilt was becoming unbearable. "I should check in with the bureau," she thought frantically. "I should remember why I'm here and what's at stake." But looking up into Dante's eyes, seeing the hope and genuine affection there, Isabella realized she was in serious trouble. The man she was supposed to bring down was becoming the man she was starting to care about, and she had no idea how she was going to survive the collision between her heart and her duty. Isabella jerked awake to the sound of Dante's phone ringing at 3 in the morning. Through the thin walls between their bedrooms, she could hear his voice, low and urgent, speaking rapid Italian that sounded nothing like the gentle tone he used with her. She'd been living in the penthouse for 2 weeks now, and she'd learned to recognize the difference between his business calls and his family calls. This was definitely business, and from the sharp edge in his voice, it wasn't good news. She slipped out of bed and crept toward her bedroom door, pressing her ear against the wood to catch whatever she could. Her Italian was rusty, but she caught enough to understand that something had happened at the warehouse on the south side, something involving fire and the Torino family. The Torinos were Dante's primary rivals, a fact she'd learned during long evenings when he thought he was casually mentioning neighborhood politics. They'd been encroaching on his territory for months, testing boundaries and challenging the delicate balance of power that kept the city's organized crime families from open warfare. When Dante's door opened and she heard his footsteps heading toward the elevator, Isabella made a split-second decision that probably violated every protocol in her training manual. She grabbed jeans and a sweater, dressed quickly, and followed him. The warehouse district at night was a maze of shadows and industrial buildings that looked identical in the darkness. Isabella kept her distance, grateful for the defensive driving course that had taught her how to tail someone without being detected. Her heart hammered as she watched Dante's sleek BMW pull into the parking lot of a nondescript building where several other expensive cars were already waiting. She parked across the street behind a delivery truck and pulled out the small pair of binoculars from her glove compartment. What she saw through the lenses made her stomach drop. The warehouse's loading dock had been bombed, leaving twisted metal and scattered debris where solid concrete should have been. Men in expensive suits moved around the destruction, their body language tense and angry. Dante stood in the center of it all, and even from a distance Isabella could see the cold fury radiating from his frame. This wasn't the gentle man who made her breakfast or the vulnerable son who'd cared for his grieving mother. This was the dangerous criminal who commanded respect through fear, and watching him in his element sent chills down her spine. She was so focused on observing the scene that she almost missed the movement in her peripheral vision. A dark SUV had pulled up behind her position, and 3 men were getting out with the kind of purposeful movement that meant serious trouble. Isabella's training kicked in before conscious thought could interfere. She was out of her car and moving toward the shadows between buildings before the men had fully oriented themselves. Years of defensive tactics training had taught her how to use cover and concealment, how to move silently and assess threats quickly. But she'd miscalculated the extent of the ambush. As she reached the corner of the nearest building, someone grabbed her from behind, one arm wrapping around her throat while a hand clamped over her mouth. Well, a voice whispered in accented English. Looks like Moretti's got himself a little spy. Isabella's panic was brief but intense. These weren't federal agents or police officers. These were Torino soldiers. And if they thought she was gathering intelligence for Dante, her life expectancy had just dropped to minutes. The man holding her was strong, but Isabella had been trained by some of the best defensive tactics instructors in the country. She drove her elbow backward into his solar plexus, twisted out of his grip as he doubled over, and had her knee heading toward his groin before he could recover. But there were 3 of them, and her advantage lasted only seconds before the other 2 were on her. Isabella fought with everything she had, using speed and technique to compensate for their superior size and strength, but she was overwhelmed by the numbers. She was pinned against the brick wall of the warehouse, one man's forearm pressed against her throat, when the sound of running footsteps made all 3 attackers freeze. Let her go, Dante's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. Isabella had never heard that tone from him before. It was cold, lethal, and carried the absolute authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. She twisted her head enough to see him approaching with 2 of his men flanking him, and the transformation was complete. This wasn't the man who worried about her comfort or cooked her breakfast. This was someone who would kill without hesitation to protect what belonged to him. Moretti, the man holding her, said, his voice steady despite the obvious tension in his frame. Your lady friend was watching your business meeting. Thought you might want to know what kind of woman you're planning to marry. Dante's eyes met Isabella's across the space between them, and she saw something flicker there. Recognition, perhaps, or at least suspicion that something wasn't right about the situation. Bella doesn't speak enough English to understand what she was seeing, he said smoothly. And she certainly doesn't have the training to follow someone without being detected. You're mistaken about her intentions. The lie came so easily that Isabella almost believed it herself. But she could see the questions forming in Dante's mind, the pieces that didn't quite fit the picture of his sheltered Sicilian bride. Maybe, the Torino soldier replied. But maybe your arrangements aren't as secure as you think they are. The threat hung in the air for a moment before Dante stepped closer, his movement casual but somehow menacing. Isabella's attacker released her immediately, clearly recognizing that continuing to hold her would escalate the situation beyond what any of them were prepared to handle. Thank you for returning my fiancée safely, Dante said, his tone conversational but his eyes promising retribution. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. The Torino men retreated to their SUV without another word, leaving Isabella alone with Dante and his security team. She sagged against the warehouse wall, adrenaline making her hands shake as the full implications of what had just happened crashed over her. Are you hurt? Dante asked, his voice shifting back to something closer to the gentle tone she knew. Isabella shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. How could she explain what she'd been doing there without revealing her true identity? How could she justify following him except to admit that she was exactly what the Torino soldiers had suggested? We need to get you home, Dante said, placing a protective hand on her lower back. This neighborhood isn't safe for you, especially at night. During the silent drive back to the penthouse, Isabella's mind raced through possible explanations for her presence at the warehouse. By the time they reached his private elevator, she'd settled on a version of the truth that might satisfy his curiosity without destroying her cover. I heard your phone call, she said as soon as his front door closed behind them. You sounded worried, and I was concerned about you. Dante turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the low lighting of the entryway. So you followed me to a dangerous part of the city in the middle of the night because you were concerned? When he put it that way, it sounded exactly as reckless as it had been. Isabella lifted her chin, channeling what she hoped looked like defensive pride rather than panic. In Sicily, wives don't sit at home wondering if their husbands are coming back, she said. If there's danger, we face it together. It wasn't entirely untrue. The fictional Bella Ricci would have grown up in a culture where family loyalty superseded personal safety, where standing by your people was more important than avoiding risk. Dante studied her face for a long moment, and Isabella forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. Finally, something in his expression softened. That kind of loyalty could get you killed, Bella. My world is more dangerous than anything you experienced in Sicily. But it's going to be my world too, she replied. If we're going to be married, if I'm going to be your wife, then I need to understand what that means. Dante crossed the space between them and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking gently across her cheekbones. The gesture was so tender after the violence of the evening that Isabella felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. You were incredible tonight, he said quietly. When those men grabbed you, most people would have been paralyzed with fear. But you fought back like you'd been trained for it. Isabella's heart stopped. This was exactly the kind of suspicion she couldn't afford to raise. Sheltered women from traditional families didn't typically have defensive combat training. My cousin taught me some basic moves, she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. He said all women should know how to protect themselves. Dante nodded, apparently accepting her explanation, but Isabella could see the questions still lingering in his mind. She needed to redirect his attention before he started thinking too clearly about what he'd witnessed. I was terrified, she admitted, which was completely true. Not just of those men, but of losing you before I really got to know you. The vulnerability in her voice wasn't entirely fabricated. Standing there in Dante's arms, still shaking from the adrenaline and fear of the evening, Isabella realized that some part of her confession was real. The thought of him being hurt or killed had genuinely terrified her, which was problematic for about a dozen professional reasons. You're not going to lose me, he promised, pulling her closer. But you're also not going to put yourself in danger like that again. Starting tomorrow, you'll have bodyguards when you leave the penthouse. Isabella wanted to protest, but she knew it would look suspicious. Instead, she nodded and let him hold her while she tried to process the evening's revelations. She'd seen Dante in his element, witnessed the power and danger that made him one of the city's most feared crime bosses. She'd also seen him risk himself to save her, watched him lie to protect her cover even when he clearly suspected something wasn't right about her story. Most importantly, she'd confirmed that the Torino family was escalating their conflict with Dante's organization. The bombing tonight was a declaration of war, and Isabella was now positioned in the center of what could become a very bloody battle. Later that night, as Dante slept in the bedroom next to hers, Isabella sat at her laptop, composing a carefully worded report for Agent Chun. She detailed the warehouse attack, the Torino involvement, and the intelligence opportunities that the escalating conflict might provide. But she found herself unable to describe the moment when Dante had looked into her eyes and chosen to protect her rather than expose her suspicious behavior. She couldn't explain the way her heart had stopped when she thought those men might hurt him, or how his gentle touch afterward had made her feel more cherished than she'd ever experienced. Instead, she stuck to the facts, the actionable intelligence that justified her continued presence in his life. Because admitting that she was falling in love with her target would end her career and destroy any chance of bringing down his organization. As she encrypted the file and sent it through secure channels, Isabella tried to convince herself that her feelings didn't matter. This was about justice, about bringing down a criminal enterprise that harmed innocent people. Whatever she was starting to feel for Dante Moretti couldn't be allowed to interfere with her duty. But lying in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling and listening for sounds from the next room, Isabella knew she was in serious trouble. The lines between Bella Ricci and Detective Rodriguez were blurring, and she was no longer certain which woman was real and which was the performance. Isabella stared at the encrypted message on her laptop screen, reading Agent Chin's words for the third time as if they might somehow change. The directive was crystal clear: execute the takedown within 48 hours using all intelligence gathered during her month undercover. The Torino escalation had convinced the Bureau that waiting any longer would put too many lives at risk. She had everything they needed. Financial records copied from Dante's computer during the brief moments when he'd left his office unlocked. photographs of key players taken discreetly at family gatherings, audio recordings from conversations he'd had in her presence, thinking she was his devoted fiancée rather than a federal agent building a case against him. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. It would put Dante away for 20 years, minimum, and dismantle the organization his family had built over 3 generations. Isabella closed the laptop and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Somewhere out there, Agent Chun was coordinating with tactical teams, preparing for raids that would happen simultaneously across multiple locations. By tomorrow night, Dante Moretti would be in federal custody, and Detective Rodriguez would finally have the career-defining bust that had eluded her for years. So why did the thought of success make her feel like she was going to be sick? Bella, Dante's voice came from behind her, warm and affectionate in the way that had become natural over the past month. I was hoping we could talk. Isabella turned to find him standing in the doorway of his home office, still dressed in the dark suit he'd worn to whatever business meeting had occupied his afternoon. But there was something different about his expression, something tender and nervous that made her pulse quicken with both anticipation and dread. Of course, she managed, hoping her voice sounded more steady than she felt. Dante crossed the living room with that confident grace she'd come to know so well, but when he reached her, he seemed almost uncertain. His hands found hers, warm and gentle as he intertwined their fingers. "This past month with you has been unlike anything I expected," he began, his green-gray eyes serious as they searched her face. "When I agreed to this arranged marriage, I thought I was making a practical decision, a way to honor family traditions while meeting my responsibilities to the organization." Isabella's chest tightened as she recognized the direction of his words. "Please don't do this," she thought desperately. "Please don't make this any harder than it already is. But you've become so much more than that, Bella. You've made this place feel like a home instead of just somewhere I sleep. You've made me remember what it feels like to want to protect someone not because it's my duty, but because the thought of losing them would destroy me." He released one of her hands to reach into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that made Isabella's heart stop completely. "I know we agreed to wait, to take time to get to know each other before making this marriage real," he continued, dropping to one knee in front of the windows overlooking the city lights. "But I can't wait anymore, Bella. I don't want a marriage of convenience or a business arrangement. I want you to be my wife because we choose each other, because we love each other." The ring was stunning, a vintage setting with a center diamond that caught the light and threw rainbows across the hardwood floor. But Isabella could barely see it through the tears that were threatening to spill over. "Bella Ricci, will you marry me? Not because our families arranged it, but because you want to spend your life with me?" Isabella stared down at him, this man she'd been planning to betray in less than 48 hours, and felt her heart shatter into pieces. His proposal was everything she might have dreamed of if she'd been the woman he thought she was. He was offering her genuine love, a real partnership, and a future that could have been beautiful if it weren't built on a foundation of lies. "Dante," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. Yes." His face was full of hope and such obvious love that Isabella had to look away. This was the moment. She could tell him the truth right now, could explain who she really was and why she'd come into his life. Maybe he would understand. Maybe he would forgive her. Maybe they could find a way through this mess together. But Agent Chin's message burned in her memory. The raids were already being planned. The evidence had already been submitted. Even if Dante forgave her, even if he was willing to walk away from his family's business, it was too late to stop what was coming. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word torn from somewhere deep inside her chest. "Yes, I'll marry you." Dante's smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to kiss her with a passion that tasted like celebration and promises and everything Isabella had never allowed herself to hope for. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Bella," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, whatever challenges we face, I want you to know that you've made me happier than I ever thought possible." "I love you too," Isabella whispered back, and realized with devastating clarity that it was the most honest thing she'd said to him since they met. The next evening, Isabella sat in Dante's study pretending to read while he worked at his computer. She'd memorized his passwords weeks ago, had been systematically copying files and documenting conversations ever since. Now she watched him review what looked like shipping manifests, completely unaware that federal agents were already moving into position around the building. Her phone vibrated once with a text message that she knew without looking was Agent Chen's final signal. The raids would begin in exactly 10 minutes. Isabella excused herself to the bathroom and activated the transmitter hidden in her engagement ring. It was a signal to the tactical team that she was clear of Dante's immediate vicinity, that they could proceed with minimal risk to the undercover operative. When she returned to the study, Dante was standing at the window with his back to her, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in rapid Italian to someone who was clearly delivering bad news. Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand clenched into a fist at his side. "What's wrong?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Federal agents had hit 3 of his warehouses simultaneously. His cousin Marco had been arrested. Bank accounts were being frozen. Everything Dante had built was crumbling around him, and he didn't yet realize that the woman he loved was the architect of his destruction. "Family business," he said without turning around, his voice strained. "Nothing you need to worry about." But Isabella could see the reflection of his face in the window, could see the moment when his expression shifted from concern to confusion to dawning recognition as sirens wailed in the distance. "Dante," she began, but he was already turning around, and the look in his eyes made her blood freeze. "Detective Rodriguez," he said quietly, and her false name died on her lips. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew exactly who she was. "I kept thinking there was something familiar about you," he continued, his voice eerily calm as footsteps thundered in the stairwell outside his penthouse. "Something about the way you moved, the way you held yourself when you thought I wasn't watching. But I told myself I was imagining things because the woman I love couldn't possibly be the same pathetic cop who tried to arrest me 6 weeks ago." The word pathetic hit Isabella like a physical blow, all the more painful because she deserved it. She had been pathetic that night, fumbling and overconfident and completely outmaneuvered. But she wasn't that woman anymore, was she? Dante stepped closer, and Isabella saw the exact moment when her broken heart reflected back at her in his eyes. "How long?" he asked. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the beginning," Isabella admitted, "because there was no point in lying now. Since the night you humiliated me in front of my entire team." His laugh was bitter and completely devoid of humor. "So this was revenge? You couldn't beat me as a cop, so you decided to destroy me as a woman?" "No," Isabella said desperately, even as she heard the penthouse door being battered down by the tactical team. "Dante, it started that way, but it's not like that now. What I feel for you is real." "Real?" His voice cracked on the word. "You've been lying about everything. Your name, your background, your feelings. How could any of it be real?" Isabella heard Agent Chen's voice shouting commands in the hallway, heard the sound of boots on marble floors as heavily armed agents flooded through Dante's home. In seconds they would burst through the study door, and this conversation would be over forever. "Because I love you," she said, the words desperate and true and completely useless. "I know you don't believe me, but Dante, I love you." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or the ghost of what they'd shared before everything went wrong. Then the study door exploded open, and federal agents poured into the room with weapons drawn and voices shouting commands. Isabella watched helplessly as the man she loved was forced to his knees, his hands zip-tied behind his back, while Agent Chen read him his rights. "Detective Rodriguez," Agent Chen said briskly as Dante was hauled to his feet. "Excellent work. We'll need a full debrief, but preliminary reports suggest we've effectively dismantled the entire organization." Isabella nodded numbly, unable to look away from Dante's face. The love and tenderness she'd grown accustomed to seeing there had been replaced by something cold and utterly final. As they led him past her toward the door, Dante stopped and met her eyes one last time. "I hope it was worth it, Detective," he said quietly. "I hope destroying us both was worth your career advancement." Then he was gone, and Isabella was alone with her success and the devastating realization that she'd just lost the only man she'd ever truly loved. But her nightmare wasn't over. As the tactical team secured the penthouse and Agent Chen coordinated with other units, Isabella's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Detective Rodriguez," an accented voice said when she answered. "This is Vincent Torino. I believe we have some mutual interests to discuss." Isabella's blood turned to ice. The Torino family had been monitoring law enforcement communications. They knew about the raids, knew about her identity, and now they had her personal phone number. You see, Vincent continued conversationally, your boyfriend's arrest has created certain opportunities for my organization, but it's also created certain problems. Problems that involve federal agents who know too much about things that should remain private. The threat was crystal clear. Isabella had just become a liability to both the investigation and her own safety. I suggest you choose your next moves very carefully, Detective, Vincent said, because now that Moretti can't protect you, you're going to discover just how dangerous this city can be for people who interfere with family business. The line went dead, leaving Isabella standing in the ruins of Dante's life with the terrible knowledge that her betrayal had endangered them both. Isabella sat in her car outside the federal courthouse at 2 in the morning, her hands shaking as she stared at the tactical gear spread across her passenger seat. Body armor, night vision goggles, lockpicks, and the untraceable pistol she'd requisitioned through channels that would never be connected back to her official identity. Everything she needed to commit career suicide and probably land herself in prison for the rest of her life. But Vincent Torino had made his intentions crystal clear over the past 72 hours. 3 safe houses had been compromised. 2 federal marshals assigned to witness protection had turned up dead, and Isabella had received hourly updates on exactly where she was and who she was with, despite being under official protection. The Torinos weren't just targeting her because she knew too much about their operations. They were targeting her because destroying Dante's organization had upset the delicate balance of power in the city, and now every family was scrambling to claim territory. Eliminating the federal agent who'd orchestrated the takedown would send a clear message about the consequences of law enforcement interference. Agent Chun had tried to convince her that protective custody was still viable, that they could relocate her somewhere safe until the prosecutions were complete. But Isabella knew better. The Torinos had resources and patience, and they would eventually find her wherever she tried to hide, unless she eliminated the threat first, which meant freeing the one man who had both the motivation and the capability to go to war with Vincent Torino's organization. Isabella checked her watch and took a steadying breath. The prisoner transport would be moving Dante from the courthouse to the federal detention center in exactly 12 minutes, taking a route she'd memorized down to every traffic light and potential ambush point. If Vincent wanted to eliminate both her and Dante tonight, that transport would be his best opportunity. She was counting on it. Isabella's radio crackled with the first reports of gunfire just as the armored transport rounded the corner into her field of view. Muzzle flashes lit up the intersection ahead as black SUVs boxed in the federal vehicle from multiple directions. The Torinos had come in force, clearly intending to eliminate Dante before he could provide testimony that might implicate their organization. What they didn't know was that Isabella had been monitoring their communications for the past 2 days, waiting for exactly this moment. She gunned her engine and raced toward the chaos, her heart hammering as she saw the transport vehicle taking heavy fire from all sides. The federal marshals inside would be outgunned and overwhelmed within minutes. Isabella abandoned her car 2 blocks away and approached on foot, using the darkness and confusion to her advantage. Her night vision goggles revealed the tactical situation clearly. 8 Torino soldiers had the transport completely surrounded, while 2 more were working on the rear doors with cutting equipment. She moved with the systematic precision of her police academy training, taking position behind a concrete barrier that gave her clear sight lines to the attackers. Her first shot took down the soldier working on the transport doors. Her second and third dropped the men providing cover fire from the north side. The remaining Torinos immediately began searching for the new threat, their formation breaking apart as they tried to identify her position. Isabella used their confusion to advance closer, picking off targets methodically while staying mobile. By the time the gunfight ended, 6 Torino soldiers were dead and the transport was free to continue to the detention center. But Isabella had other plans. She approached the damaged rear doors of the armored vehicle, her weapon lowered but ready as she called out to the marshals inside. Federal Agent Rodriguez, she identified herself. I need you to release the prisoner into my custody. The senior marshal who emerged from the vehicle was bleeding from a head wound, but alert enough to recognize the insanity of her request. Agent Rodriguez, That prisoner is federal property. I can't just hand him over to you in the middle of a street fight. Isabella held up her badge with one hand, while keeping her weapon visible with the other. This isn't a request, Marshal. The Torinos will be back with reinforcements within minutes, and they won't stop until Moretti is dead. You can release him to me now, or you can explain to your superiors why you let a key witness get murdered on your watch. The Marshal hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and pragmatism. Behind him, Isabella could see Dante watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. She's right, Dante said quietly. Vincent won't give up until he eliminates both of us. Your choice is to trust her or watch everyone in this vehicle die when his backup arrives. The sound of approaching sirens made the Marshal's decision for him. He unlocked Dante's restraints and stepped aside, his face grim. This is on you, Agent Rodriguez, he said. Whatever happens next is your responsibility. Isabella nodded and gestured for Dante to follow her. They had maybe 5 minutes before the area would be crawling with law enforcement, and she needed them both far away before anyone started asking questions she couldn't answer. They ran through the maze of abandoned buildings that surrounded the industrial district, Isabella leading the way to the safe house she'd prepared for exactly this contingency. It wasn't much, just a two-room apartment above a closed auto shop, but it was off the grid and stocked with everything they would need to survive the next few days. Dante followed her up the narrow staircase in silence, but she could feel his eyes on her back, could practically hear the questions he wasn't asking yet. Why? He said as soon as the door closed behind them. Isabella turned to face him, and for the first time since the night of his arrest, she allowed herself to really look at him. 3 days in federal custody had left him exhausted and hollow-eyed, but he was still the most beautiful man she'd ever seen. Still the man she'd fallen hopelessly in love with despite every logical reason she should hate him. Because Vincent Torino was going to kill us both, she said simply. And because I couldn't let that happen. That's not what I'm asking, and you know it. Dante stepped closer, his green-gray eyes searching her face intently. You just threw away your career, probably your freedom, possibly your life, to save someone you betrayed 3 days ago. Why? Isabella felt tears threaten for the first time since his arrest. Because I love you, she whispered. Because everything I said to you was a lie except that. My name, my background, my reasons for being there, all of it was fake. But what I feel for you is the most real thing I've ever experienced. Dante stared at her for a long moment, and Isabella braced herself for his anger, his rejection, his complete dismissal of everything she'd just confessed. Instead, he reached up and cupped her face in his hands with the same gentle reverence he'd shown her as Bella. I know, he said quietly. I've known since that first night when you followed me to the warehouse. Sheltered women from traditional families don't fight like trained operatives, Bella. They don't move like cops or think like investigators. Isabella's breath caught. You knew? I suspected. And I had your background investigated the next day. The real Bella Ricci died in a car accident 2 years ago in Palermo. Then why didn't you expose me? Why didn't you turn me in? Dante's thumbs brushed gently across her cheekbones, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Because despite everything logical and rational, despite knowing you were there to destroy me, I was falling in love with you too. The woman who cooked breakfast with me, who worried about my safety, who looked at me like I was someone worth saving instead of someone worth arresting. That woman was real, even if her name wasn't. Isabella felt something break open in her chest, a flood of relief and hope and desperate love that threatened to overwhelm her completely. I'm so sorry, Dante. I'm sorry I lied. I'm sorry I betrayed you. I'm sorry I destroyed your life. He silenced her with a kiss that tasted like forgiveness and second chances and everything she'd thought she'd lost forever. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. My life needed to be destroyed, Isabella, he said, using her real name for the first time. I've been telling myself for years that what I did was necessary, that I was protecting my family and honoring my father's legacy. But the truth is that I was trapped in a world that was never really mine, following a path that was chosen for me before I was old enough to understand what it meant. You don't have to say that, Isabella whispered. You don't have to pretend this is what you wanted. I'm not pretending. Dante pulled back enough to meet her eyes directly. These past 3 days in custody, All I could think about was how you'd given me a glimpse of what my life could be like with someone who loved me for myself, not for my power or my family name. Someone who saw past the reputation and the violence to whatever decent man might still exist underneath. But your family, your responsibilities, will survive without me. My cousin Marco is already negotiating plea deals that will keep most of the family out of prison. The legitimate businesses will continue under new management. And the illegal operations. Honestly, Isabella, I'm tired of being responsible for other people's choices to break the law. Isabella searched his face, looking for any sign that he was telling her what she wanted to hear rather than what he truly felt. What are you saying, Dante? I'm saying I want out. I want a chance to build something new, something clean, with the woman I love. If she'll have me, knowing everything I've done and everything I've been. Before Isabella could respond, the sound of vehicles pulling up outside made them both freeze. Through the grimy window, she could see black SUVs surrounding the building. Vincent found us, Dante said grimly. He must have been monitoring law enforcement frequencies. Isabella moved to the window and counted at least 8 men positioning themselves around the building's exits. This wasn't a capture mission. This was an execution squad. He's not taking any chances, she said. He wants us both dead tonight. Then we make sure he's the one who doesn't walk away, Dante replied, his voice carrying the cold authority she remembered from that first night at his club. Isabella turned to look at him and saw the exact moment when he made his choice. Not the choice to be the man his father had trained him to be, but the choice to be the man he wanted to become. For her. For them. They spent the next 20 minutes turning the small apartment into a fortress, using furniture to block sight lines and create defensive positions. Isabella's law enforcement training combined with Dante's intimate knowledge of urban warfare created a strategy that might actually give them a chance against superior numbers. The attack came just after midnight. Isabella lost count of the gunshots, the sound of splintering wood, the shouts of men trying to coordinate their assault, while she and Dante systematically eliminated them from carefully prepared positions. But she would never forget the moment when Dante deliberately exposed himself to draw fire away from her position, or the way he looked at her across the chaos and mouthed the words "I love you" like he was afraid he might not get another chance to say them. When the gunfire finally stopped, 8 men lay dead in the street outside, and Vincent Torino was bleeding out on the apartment stairs with Dante's gun pressed to his chest. This ends now, Vincent, Dante said quietly. No more threats. No more war. No more families destroyed over territory and pride. Vincent's laugh was wet and bitter. You think killing me ends anything? You think walking away makes you clean? It makes me free, Dante replied. And sometimes that's enough. The shot was quick and final, and Isabella felt no sympathy for the man who would have killed them both without hesitation. In the silence that followed, Dante dropped his weapon and turned to face her. The dangerous crime boss was gone, replaced by a man who looked exhausted and somehow lighter, like he'd finally put down a burden he'd been carrying for too long. It's over, he said simply. Isabella nodded, though she knew the reality was more complicated. There would be investigations, questions, consequences for both of them that couldn't be avoided or explained away. But looking at Dante, seeing the peace in his expression despite everything they'd just survived, Isabella realized that some things mattered more than consequences. 6 months later, Isabella Rodriguez and Dante Moretti were married in a small ceremony at a beach house in North Carolina, far from the city where their story had begun. Isabella wore a simple white dress and flowers in her hair, while Dante looked handsome and relaxed in a light blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up. The guest list was small. Isabella's foster sister who'd driven down from Virginia, Agent Chun who'd helped negotiate Isabella's resignation from the Bureau in lieu of prosecution, and Dante's mother who'd flown in from Sicily with tears in her eyes and forgiveness in her heart. Isabella had left law enforcement to open a private investigation firm that specialized in missing persons and cold cases. Work that mattered, work that helped people, work that didn't require her to pretend to be anyone other than herself. Dante had used his remaining legitimate assets to start a construction company that focused on affordable housing development. It was hard, honest work that made him proud in ways that power and fear never had. They'd both given up everything they thought they wanted to build something neither of them had known was possible. As they exchanged vows with the ocean breeze lifting Isabella's hair and the sunset painting everything golden, Dante took her hands and spoke words he'd written himself. Isabella, you came into my life as someone else entirely, but you became the person who saved me from myself. You showed me that love is about choice, not obligation, and that the strongest foundations are built on truth, not tradition. Isabella's voice was steady as she replied, Dante, you taught me that sometimes the most important cases are the ones we solve with our hearts instead of our heads. You showed me what it means to be truly seen and valued, not for what I can do, but for who I am. When the small ceremony was over and the photographs were taken, Isabella found herself standing at the water's edge with her new husband, watching the waves roll in and thinking about how different this ending was from anything she'd imagined when she first put on that wire and walked into his club. Do you ever regret it? She asked quietly. Everything you gave up for this. Dante's arm tightened around her waist as he considered the question seriously. I regret the years I wasted living someone else's idea of what my life should be, he said finally. I regret the people who got hurt because of choices I made out of fear and obligation. But regret loving you? Regret choosing this life with you? Never. Isabella leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of him against her side and the promise of their future stretching out ahead of them like the endless ocean. Here's what I want to know from all of you who've been following this incredible journey with Isabella and Dante. Have you ever had to choose between duty and love? Have you found yourself in a situation where doing the right thing felt completely wrong, or where the person you were supposed to oppose became the person you couldn't live without? Because sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that start with the worst possible circumstances and transform into something neither person saw coming. 3 years later, Isabella Moretti stood in the nursery of their home, holding their 6-month-old daughter Sophia, while Dante assembled what appeared to be the world's most complicated crib. The construction business had grown beyond their wildest expectations, providing good jobs for dozens of families while building homes that people could actually afford. Isabella's investigation firm had solved 17 missing person cases and helped reunite families that had given up hope. But their greatest achievement slept peacefully in Isabella's arms, a perfect combination of her mother's determined spirit and her father's protective instincts. You know, Isabella said as she watched Dante wrestle with what looked like 17 different types of screws, when I imagined my future as a federal agent, it never included watching my former target struggle with Swedish furniture instructions. Dante looked up with mock indignation. Former target? I prefer to think of myself as your greatest success story. Isabella laughed, the sound rich with contentment and genuine joy. You definitely are, she agreed. Though I have to say, Detective Rodriguez never could have imagined that her biggest bust would end up being the love of her life. And Bella Ricci never existed, but somehow she helped 2 people find exactly what they were looking for. As Sophia stirred in her arms and Dante finally managed to attach the crib rail correctly, Isabella marveled at how completely her life had changed from that night when she'd failed to arrest the man who would become her husband. Sometimes the most important investigations don't end with handcuffs and convictions. Sometimes they end with wedding rings and baby cribs and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. Outside their bedroom window, the city lights twinkled like stars, and Isabella Moretti fell asleep in the arms of the man who'd taught her that the greatest victories aren't always the ones you plan for. Sometimes they're the ones that plan for you.